My photo taste is the Pinterest because they are the best.
This is a download from BBC Learning English. To find out more, visit our website.
6 Minute English from bbclearningenglish.com.
Hello and welcome to 6 Minute English. I'm Alice.
And I'm Neil. Hello.
Hello, Neil. Now, what do you know about Robin Hood?
Okay. Well, he wore green tights.
Yes, he did.
He was good at archery. He had a girlfriend called Maid Marian. He was English. Although sometimes he has an American accent in Hollywood films.
Yes.
There was a great Disney cartoon series using animal characters. Robin and Maid Marian were foxes.
Anything else? What about being an outlaw or criminal? Heroically fighting against injustice and corruption.
Oh, yeah, there's all that stuff as well. Robbing the rich and giving to the poor. Yes, yeah. He lived in Sherwood Forest with a band of merry men.
Well, yes, he did. Okay, it sounds like you've watched a lot of TV and film versions, but haven't read the literature.
Oh, come on, Alice. Have you read the literature?
Yes, I have. I studied English at university, and one of my specialist subjects was medieval literature. The Middle Ages or medieval period lasted in Europe from the 5th to the 15th century.
I see, and I'm guessing that Robin Hood is the subject of today's show.
Absolutely, you're right. So, here's a question for you, Neil. When do we find the first reference to Robin Hood in English literature? Was it in the A, 5th century, B, 10th century, or C, 14th century?
Well, I'm going to go for the middle one, and that's B, the 10th century.
Okay, well, we'll find out if you're right or wrong later on. Now, why do you think the stories of Robin Hood have lasted from the Middle Ages through to the modern day?
Well, I suppose it's got appeal on lots of levels. Action, adventure, there's some comedy stuff there with the merry men, and of course romance, like I said before.
Oh, yes, indeed. But actually, the early versions of Robin Hood were very violent. Let's listen to Professor Thomas Hahn talk about one of the ballads called The Monk.
The Monk is, I think, for most modern audiences who've either seen movies or read children's stories or whatever, quite disturbing in terms of its levels of violence. In terms of trying to make some comparisons with popular culture, I mean, it seems to me that it's really at the level of Sopranos in terms of things like dismembered bodies and actual violence and assassinations.
What's a ballad, Alice?
Well, it's a song or poem that tells a story. People were telling stories of Robin Hood for a long time before they were written down, and performing them too.
Really? And how about the comparison between the Robin Hood ballads and The Sopranos? Now, The Sopranos is a popular US TV series about gangsters. Maybe I should get The Monk on audiobook. What do you think?
Yes, I don't think you'd find it disturbing. Well, disturbing means making you feel upset or shocked. Assassinations are the murder of important people, often for political reasons, and dismembered bodies are bodies that have been cut or torn to pieces.
Right. It sounds like medieval entertainment for guys, like martial arts movies these days.
Well, yes, you may be right. Now, do you remember you mentioned Maid Marian at the start of the show?
I do.
Well, actually, in the early ballads, there is no Maid Marian. She appears in later versions along with other characters we know well today. But Robin is always a trickster and a man with a bow in a wood.
A trickster is someone who deceives or cheats people. That's impressive, Alice. You certainly know your medieval ballads.
Yes, I do. So, what's appealing about this man with a bow? Let's listen to Professor Hahn again.
What he represents, I think, is a kind of strong and forceful masculinity that operates on its own terms and for its own interests. And that's, I think, what we admire in those stories.
What does it mean to operate on your own terms, Alice?
Well, Neil, it means to do what you want according to your own rules. And masculinity means the qualities typical of a man. Now, remember my question from earlier? I asked, when do we find the first reference to Robin Hood in English literature? Was it in the A, 5th century, B, 10th century, or C, 14th century.
And I said B, 10th century.
Yes, well, I'm afraid you are wrong, Neil. The first reference occurs in English poet William Langland's book Piers Plowman, written between 1370 and 1390. Sloth, the lazy priest, says, I cannot parfit leave my paternoster at the priest it singeth, but I can rhymes of Robin Hood and Randolph Earl of Chester.
Wow, Alice. Can you translate that into modern English, please? Maybe that's for another show.
Maybe another show.
Can we just have today's words again, please?
We certainly can, and we can have those in modern English. Okay, here they are. Outlaw. Medieval period or Middle Ages. Ballad. Disturbing. Assassinations. Dismembered bodies. Trickster. Operate on your own terms. Masculinity.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's 6-Minute English. We hope you enjoyed today's Walk in the Woods. Please do join us again. Goodbye.
Bye.
My photo taste is the Pinterest because they are the best. Flick to link, a link to flick.
How do we make drugs that, potentially have, like a lot of drugs are bitter. So how can you make drugs that are bitter offset that so that, like, kids can take it and they can get better if they need that drug? And so that's just one more piece of the equation. It's not an end-all to us solving, like, a problem around obesity by any means, but it is something that we need to consider in terms of how our bodies work in modern day life, which is, modern day life is not how our bodies evolved to live.
I have to assume that, like, over time, our taste evolves pretty radically. Like, if you were to take a Neolithic human, right, and drop them into, 21st century Earth, they would freak out because they would taste things and it would just be so crazy to them, right?
So taste preference is innate. So we are born liking sweet. We are born not liking bitter. That's in all of our DNA for the most part. Unlike smells, like there's no smell that everyone loves or there's no smell that everyone hates across the world. But taste, we really have this. So if you dropped somebody from Neolithic times into our time, they would probably still like sweet and probably still not like bitter. The thing that I love around taste and flavor research in this day and age is how much we are now seeing this cultural mixing of the foods that we eat, no matter where you are in the world. And so the ideas behind it is how, as humans, do we think about what we have innate preferences for, but then be food adventurous enough to survive in a world that's actually much more diverse than the little world that we live in.
Nicole Garneau is a curator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. You can see her full talk at ted.npr.org. Today on the show, ideas about the 5 senses. So, before we get started, you were the guy who played Weasel Wiesel on Saved by the Bell?
That's right.
Would you call that, like, the pinnacle of your achievements?
I would call that an awful television show that I had a lot of fun being on.
Did you continue to act after that role?
No, so around this time, by my mid to late teens, my sight was becoming a substantial nuisance. Probably by my early 20s, it was a disability, and by the time I was 25, I was blind.
Isaac Litsky might have been on track to turn a successful run as a child actor into a lifelong thing. But at age 13, he was diagnosed with a genetic disease that caused the cells in his retina to progressively die off.
So progressive deterioration of your sight and ultimately blindness. Sitting in the car on the way home from that doctor's office, I knew that blindness was going to completely ruin my life.
You thought that at age 13?
I didn't think it. I knew it. I knew it. It was my reality.
But blindness didn't ruin Isaac's life. In fact, he ended up graduating from Harvard. He got a law degree, even worked for 2 different Supreme Court justices. And today, he runs his own successful business. But back when he was a kid, to see that path forward, Isaac had to grapple with what it meant not to see at all. Here's Isaac Litsky on the TED stage.
What does it feel like to see? You open your eyes and there's the world. Seeing is believing, sight is truth, right? Well, that's what I thought. Then, from age 12 to 25, my sight became an increasingly bizarre carnival funhouse hall of mirrors and illusions. Objects appeared, morphed, and disappeared in my reality. It was difficult and exhausting to see. I pieced together fragmented, transitory images until I saw nothing at all. I learned that what we see is not universal truth. It is not objective reality. What we see is a unique, personal, virtual reality that is masterfully constructed by our brain. Let me explain with a bit of amateur neuroscience. Your visual cortex takes up about 30% of your brain. That's compared to approximately 8% for touch and 2 to 3% for hearing. Sight is 1/3 of your brain by volume and can claim about 2/3 of your brain's processing resources. It's no surprise then that the illusion of sight is so compelling. But make no mistake about it, sight is an illusion. A hill appears steeper if you've just exercised, and a landmark appears farther away if you're wearing a heavy backpack. You create your own reality.
It's the TED Radio Hour from NPR. I'm Guy Raz. And on today's show, ideas about the power of networks, how those connections and those pathways define the world around us, in our cities, in our relationships, in our bodies, and especially in nature. So about 25 years ago, forest ecologist Suzanne Simard had a hunch.
Yes, that's right.
She thought that trees could talk.
Just imagine, like, when you're walking through the forest, you hear the crunching of the twigs under your feet and the rustling of the leaves.
But she thought, what if there's more going on?
Like a big chattering going on that we can't hear. That they're attuned to each other.
Now, at the time, and again, this is about 25 years ago, a team of scientists in England were wrapping up an experiment.
Where they'd grown in the laboratory these pine seedlings together in little root boxes that you could see through.
And the scientists took 2 of these pine seedlings, these baby trees, that were in the same box, in the same dirt, and then they exposed one of these seedlings to a radioactive carbon dioxide gas.
Carbon-14, a radioactive carbon.
And what they found was that some of that radioactive gas, the carbon-14, made its way into the second seedling.
You could visualize it, you could see it.
And so from this experiment, it seemed that somehow these 2 plants in the same dirt were connected.
And I thought, wow, maybe this is what's going on in my forest.
Maybe, Suzanne Simard thought, maybe all the trees in a forest were connected in a kind of network.
Yeah, like our airport system, our transportation system, our social networks.
And maybe, she thought, all of this was happening underground.
When we walk through the forest, what we see as human beings, we just see these, beautiful trees growing out of the ground, but we don't see that they're actually completely linked underground in this superhighway.
So Suzanne decided to prove this underground network existed. She devised an experiment using some of the same radioactive gas, a Geiger counter to measure it, and a patch of birch and fir trees.
I figured the birch and the fir would be connected in a below-ground web.
Suzanne picks up the story from the TED stage.
And I gathered my apparatus, plastic bags and duct tape and shade cloth, a paper suit, a respirator. And then I borrowed some high-tech stuff from my university, a Geiger counter, a mass spectrometer, microscopes. The first day of the experiment, we got out to our plot, and I pulled on my white paper suit, I put on my respirator, I put the plastic bags over my trees. I got my giant syringes, and I injected carbon-14, the radioactive gas, into the bag of birch. I waited an hour. I figured it would take this long for the trees to suck up the CO2 through photosynthesis, send it down into their roots, and maybe shuttle that carbon below ground to their neighbors. I went to my first bag with the birch. I pulled the bag off. I ran my Geiger counter over its leaves. perfect. The birch had taken up the radioactive gas. Then the moment of truth. I went over to the fir tree.
Flick to link link.